Thank you. I feel bad from preventing you from eating, preventing you from talking, and I'm going to present a whole bunch of stuff to you at the same time. So hopefully at least some of it will be worth it. I also have planned a real live demo of this adaptive classroom, and I'll do that at the end. So maybe if you've finished your dinner, you can pull out your laptop and we can try and see what happens with that. Okay. So thank you for the introduction. I mean, it was so elaborate that I can actually skip half of my talk now. But I would just tell you with Foldit, I mean, it's now a 5-year-long project. It's a sort of like a research project that would not die. Because there's now this community, and even though all the funding agencies are saying, oh, you've shown everything, why, I can't let them go, right? So there's a whole bunch of stuff exciting. So now they're developing brand new proteins that don't exist in nature. We're actually doing drug design. We're actually dealing with lawyers of figuring out when we actually end up discovering some of those things. Who owns it? How do we actually have pharmas want to develop drugs at the same time as not reap the 20 years of gouging people for prices, which is what usually happens in that particular space. We're also just enrolled in NanoCrafter at Games for Change last week. I announced it. It's basically a game that maps synthetic biology or creative creation of nanomachines into a representation that even middle schoolers can actually do creative design on. Of course, this is just the first step. It's going to, again, take us another 3 or 4 years before we actually see what happens here. But there's some really interesting things. You can build sort of walkers that walk from one part of the cell to another and transport atoms and stuff. And that stuff directly goes into the laboratory. I'm not going to tell you about any of that stuff today. I'm going to tell you about the key goal that I have been thinking about for a while now, which is how do we get any students in any classroom with any teacher to get to 95% of them getting 100% of mastery, right? So what is, those numbers are insane, right, for most people. As Robert tells me often, like when I go to a classroom, what I see is kids are dying. It took me a while to understand what he meant by kids are dying, but it's when you go to a classroom, you actually see it's actually happening. I mean, we had some trials where kids are literally under the table, just not able to actually even bring themselves up above. So, I mean, the challenges are just enormous. And then we look at these games, and of course, I could give you this sort of preaching to the converted set of things, the promises, the gains, but I'm going to give you something opposite. I'm going to give you the key fundamental reasons why games by themselves are problematic in this space. Okay? The first one is scope. If you go out there and you want to actually present the curriculum of any particular volume, it's practically impossible to have a single game or even collection of games to actually have a reasonable scope. If you say, how many Common Core concepts are you actually covering with this thing? It ends up being very, very, very hard to get anything but maybe partial completion of 2 or 3 of those items, right? That is a big problem. If you actually want to sort of deploy it out there and show some kind of effect, you want effects on some tests. There's no way you can have effects on tests unless you have some scope size, right? The second one is time on task. If you look at Angry Birds, whatever else is out there, there's not that many people that play Angry Birds for 6 months straight, right? I mean, but you want to use the same mechanism to have learning, which you need 6 months straight or lot longer, right? So what does that really mean? Are we using the right tool for this, right? How do we get this prolonged engagement that goes beyond what the most successful games are out there? I mean, Angry Birds doesn't matter. You pay, I don't know how much is it, $3.99 for that game. You like it, you have some experience, you quit after a while, that's great. They're making money. The game, they just need to have another game like it within the next 2-3 months, and they can get another $3.99 from you, right? But in education, it's a completely different ballgame. The third thing is real-world integration, right? So what does it mean? So you have this game, right? And Navarros created this game. It's like, great, use it in a classroom. And then what? What happened? Nobody has any idea, right? Oftentimes, it's Friday. The teachers are completely exhausted by the whole prospects of teaching. Let's just have them send them off there and play games, right? And that's not what we really want, right? We want this deep effect. So the question is, how do we integrate it such that the teacher does the best possible thing with that game? How do we integrate it such that parents are actually promoting the kids' learning in the best possible way with this sort of multi-generational learning that could be surrounded by the game, right? So how do we actually make sure that transfer really happens? I can't tell you how many of these games have shown that in-game assessment thing works really well. Yeah, you send them off on paper, everything falls flat, okay? So what is it, this scaffolding thing that brings it out to the real world where you actually can generalize it beyond this fantastic imaginary world you have? The other one is that you really need to sort of optimize for two things at the same time, engagement and mastery. This kind of dual optimization is very crazy and impossible thing to do. If you actually start using the basic game design processes, you start to realize that they don't work. They don't work in this concept. Here are some key examples for this. So this is one of our games. If you sort of, any game design book that you open, everybody's going to tell you about this sort of like Csikszentmihalyi curve, right? So it's basically you stay in this zone of engagement, right? But it turns out when you actually automatically discover the specific progression you should get to people, you get something like this. You give them first the easiest possible level, and then you expect that about 85% of them will do not so great on it, and you give them the next sort of level in that progression. But for those that do really well, you give them the hardest possible level next, right? This is not exactly proximal zone of development of any sort, right? But the data basically automatically discovered this. I had to put reason onto this, but this is the actual policy that actually attracts most people in this space, right? So completely in juxtaposition with sort of the standard thing that everybody believes is the case. Same thing here. So for example, if you observe the number of people that drop off, every game kind of has this kind of drop-off curve. And now you look at secondary reward effect. If I give you all these extra stars and things that you can collect along the way, the assumption is you're going to have people stay a little bit longer, right? And the reality on 40,000 people randomized trial is this. You lose 40% more people if you do that, unless the stars are directly related with the main objective of that particular level, right? Completely in opposition to what a lot of game companies that make money actually end up doing in this case, right? Here's another one, more related to education, with hinting, right? So we basically had another huge randomized trials with seeing which kind of hints actually promote the most kinds of learning. So you can basically see that we've actually increased the hints in amount of abstractive knowledge. So you can actually think a lot more here than actually just do this, right? And how many of you think that this was the most effective hint? Raise your hand. This one. This one. OK. So it's a little bit of a trick question. It turns out that none of them were effective because the dimension that was the most important is how this was presented. So if these hints are presenting unsolicited, it seems like it creates a sense of failure to kids, right? So the particular, you have to be very careful about how hints are presented, because otherwise they end up feeling like they failed and actually doing worse than if they don't get the hints at all. Okay? These kinds of things you can only find out when you actually try it on very large numbers. But the key point is the dimensionality of this space is enormous. So many things you can vary. And there's no way you can actually figure out exactly even which dimensions to study first. That's how big that is. OK. So pretty depressing thing for lunch. I really apologize. But there is hope, and that's the rest of my talk. So last June, we did an algebra challenge over on Washington State. We asked, can kids solve 250,000 of equations in 5 days? We basically asked teachers, spend 1.5 hours at max on this, and let's see what you can do. We've then done it on other things, and here's the foreshadowing of what I'll describe later. But this is the percentage of kids that reached 100% mastery, meaning solving 3 complex linear equations without making a single error within a particular expected time. Okay? You can see that even in elementary school, this 7th grade concept that takes about a month to do in the curriculum is mastery. Ignore the kindergarten. There were only 3 kindergartners, and they're particularly zealous, so this is not. Okay, so what happened there? This is 93% mastery on 7th grade content over the entire K-12 spectrum. Hour and a half. It's crazy. So I'll try to give you the key aspects of the framework that I think are actually necessary to get any kind of things to that side. And before I do that, I would basically want to point out that if you just look at a curriculum, try to optimize it. If you just look at students and try to sort of adapt to that, or just teacher development, it's not, you're forgetting too many things. You need to look at the whole thing as an ecosystem and see how many variables that are all interdependent between these things affect the entire process towards maximal outcomes. And so the more, I mean, I didn't have this view originally. I started thinking, well, games can do a lot of stuff. Then you realize a single intervention by a teacher that's just right 2 minutes after some gameplay can increase the outcome on a test score by over 30%. Okay? So that made me think, what are the set of combinations of all of these things that we can do that can actually have the most possible outcomes? And you start realizing, well, we're isolating things that really shouldn't be isolated. We really need to look at them all at the same time. Okay, so here are the set of things that we're basically doing. First, and perhaps the most importantly, we don't assume that anything that you really want to adapt to every individual kid cannot be fixed. Okay? And that already throws out most of the games out there today, because they're designed by designers. There's a specific progression. They actually don't like you to change that kind of progression. Right? You can actually vary different parameters within each level. The second piece is the data-driven optimal pathway discovery. So now we're discovering the best progression of things, not just the best next thing, which is a greedy optimization, if you will, but the best sequence of things that you can do. So let me just give you a most banal example that we discovered. It was not known by any learning scientist that I've talked to. If you start with fractions, right, one of the most common thing is we have a cookie, which we'll probably get shortly afterwards here. And you have 2 friends. What do? You split it into 2, and you give it to each kid. Now you have 4 kids. Well, you take every half, and you split it into 2. Great. Everybody's on track. Fantastic pathway. Then you tell them, now you have 3 kids. What do? Over 70% of the kids say it cannot be done. Okay? So we had a very quick pathway of getting them somewhere, but then slam, bottleneck, right, that now you have to undo. It turns out if you start with a 1/3 first, it takes them longer than 1/2 in that splitting, but you no longer have that. And it's not that long term in this case. It's only like 2 steps ahead, but it points to the necessity for looking at long-term effects rather than very short-term greedy effects. And the same thing is the case, like in general, if you look at how much you need to know the fractions to pass a test in fractions in 4th or 5th grade, is very different from how much you need to do algebra later on. And we don't discover that until 7th and 8th grade, right? So that's a much longer term, and that dependency is not visible, and that becomes a big problem. Okay, the final thing is that and this has been bugging me for a while, is how do we basically have an insight into the entire thing that happens in the classroom? That's not just the game. It's like all these things that teacher does, all the things that teacher can say, all the ways teachers can assist other things. And that's something that I'm going to demo to you towards the end of this talk as well. And you see, the key thing here is, implementation fidelity. This is a problem for every curriculum out there, digital or not. How do you know that what you wrote for teachers or for parents or wherever is actually done? We collect this data, we analyze the effectiveness of the curriculum, but we have no idea how the teachers actually use this thing in any way, right? The variation, if you look at it, is enormous, right? So how do you account for that? The other one is, you know, and I've thought about this for a little bit and realized that teachers, if you want to do teacher development at scale, you can't do it outside of the classroom. It's just that most teachers who need it the most don't have time or don't want to go out somewhere else and spend hours outside of the classroom getting better. It's just, I mean, I don't have sort of definitive data here, but that seems to be. So the question is, how can they actually learn on the fly with the data in the classroom about what is the best way to vary their particular practices towards better outcomes, right? So it's not about showing them data. It's about figuring out what the next best action thing is. And so that, to me, is one of the biggest outcomes. All right, so let's take a look at this infinite curriculum. If you look at sort of the way in which any adaptivity today is done, and this is the case for curricula, not just for games, it's kind of this gated thing, right? You have the, and it's kind of, it comes from the fact that everything is, all of these adaptive things come from the assessment world, right? So the idea is, I know how to assess you well, right? So I can sort of give this 95% likelihood that you understand this material based on item response theory, right? And if you don't pass it, what do I do? Well, let's just do a little bit more of the same. And let's do more of the same and, until, hopefully, you go through. And they're actually companies making millions of dollars selling this kind of technology. You're laughing over that. But the key problem is item-based kind of assessment is not going to tell you what the next best thing is for the kid to get the most amount of learning with that very next experience. There's nothing about that particular assessment that even thinks about that, right? So why are we using that for most of those things, right? So what we need instead is a much finer grained specialization to maximize the learning. So to do that, let me just give you one simple didactic thing. So this is not a game, because it would be a little bit more complicated explaining the game. But let's take this. This is a curriculum that we're now converted into this infinite progression set. So this is comparing numbers, right? So you have this particular process. You need to compare which number is bigger. And if you look at sort of what kids really need to do, it kind of is, can be represented in this kind of schematic, right? So you start looking at, is it the same number of digits? If not, et cetera, right? So I can sort of look at every problem that I give to a kid is going to a different path on this particular thought process that the kid has to go through. And it's this particular representation that allows us to have sort of theory-agnostic sort of breakdown of all kinds of processes that kids need to learn. So for example, if this particular problem is exactly this particular path. All right, so turns out we've developed a thought process language. It's a very specific language. I'm a computer scientist, so that's how I think. But it turns out it can embed all the problems that I've encountered in math, physics, and reading comprehension as well, as it'll come up. So as you notice, the key thing is about the traces. You would follow the traces of thought processes. And there's some very powerful things we can do here. We can rank the difficulty between problems by just seeing how many different components on this path are different between one problem or the other. We can analyze and compare different progressions of learning, and we can synthesize progression. This is the most important thing for me, because I need to synthesize arbitrary things to specialize for every kid. So let's take a look at how can we compare. If I look at one curriculum, that page that you've seen, this is the breakdown of each one of these is a thought process for one problem, and the arrows indicate the progressions that that particular curriculum has created. If I look at Singapore math, yet another highly acclaimed curriculum, you see that two things. One is they almost don't even use the same kind of problems. Two, Singapore math focuses specifically on cycling between these two types of problems over and over, whereas Jump math actually explores some of these longer patterns. Okay? Both of them are expert-created, highly acclaimed curriculum, but it turns out none of them are right, because they compare very small space. And so this is curriculum, but for games it's even worse. That space is even bigger, because games are often open-ended things rather than such specific tasks like I just showed here. Okay, it turns out, for example, if I want to say let's say somebody does a problem previous to this, and I realize that they have exactly the problem with one aspect of this thought process. I can now generate the problem that has just that problem in that they're struggling on and nothing else, everything else stripped away. So I can have direct zoom-in remediation just for that particular content and then zoom back up. And that's the power of this adaptive curriculum, because it allows me to sort of target the very next thing simply based on specific targeted kind of misconception that the student had at that particular time. Okay, so this now works. We've created a sort of adaptive version of DragonBox that does some of these things. How many of you know what the faded worked examples are? Do I need to describe that? A few of you. Okay. So it turns out you can also automatically generate explanation for arbitrary generated content. So in this case, this is a puzzle game. It requires both spatial reasoning and fractional decomposition here. This is all automatically generated, and it's automatically generated for any level I can generate. It's basically simply tracing the thought process through that language that I have described, right? So it's actually highly detailed, and it basically considers some aspects of working memory, what you should be thinking about, not just what are the set of things you should be putting, but why and what you should be thinking. And so you can imagine now, so this is all direct playback, but I can stop this anywhere and say what should be the next thing. So now I can fade the learning from just seeing everything to doing one little thing, doing another little thing. I'm stringing them together until you have full autonomy of any particular complex process that you need to do. And this whole process automatically comes out of the representation of what kids should be thinking in order to solve problems like this. And that's the key power of this kind of curriculum. So let me just point out that how complex things can get. So this is another problem. You actually have to put parentheses in the right place. So now you have to estimate certain computations. You have to think a little bit harder. If I look at the space of all possible differentiated problems, it's this large. This is automatically generated, right? This is why an expert kind of do this, because it's just for that problem, this is how large it is. And if I zoom in into here, each one of those little circles is a bucket of hundreds of problems that exercise exactly the same thought process. Okay? If there's an edge, it means that this particular thought process is a subset of the total set of things that the kid needs to think about in order to do this. Okay? So I didn't need anybody to break this down for me, right? I've broken it down simply by describing what the kids should be thinking of. And that means that I now have the full coverage of the space of the whole problem. What's also interesting is, if you wanted to give kids the sense of how far am I from mastering this particular Common Core concept, the answer is, how can you get this whole space green, right? That's the coverage of all possible kind of exercises is this. So that you automatically have the direct sense of progress for kids as they're conquering this space. You can even allow them to say, OK, I want to get to this. Right? What's the best way for me to get there? And basically, they could say, oh, this is too hard for me. Let me try something else that will actually lead me to there. Right? So this whole thing now is automatically created. Many, many different things are possible. OK. What I want to tell you about is that this generalization can actually go into much bigger things. So in this case, imagine a world where you want to learn algebra, but you want to learn it in a science fiction domain. Or you want to learn it in the Harry Potter world, like my daughter does. Or you want to learn it in some medieval thing or whatever. And I want to create my own characters. And I want to say who's friends with whom, who's an enemy with whom, etc. And then I want my whole algebra to be in that world. Right? So it turns out you can actually do that too. And basically we have a framework now that I'm really excited about. And actually there's some testing agency, which I cannot name, that are interested in using this as basically initiation of the process through validation, where we can actually generate huge numbers. Why is that interesting? So for example, I can pose exactly the same problem with a different language. Okay? Turns out almost nobody in literature really understands what aspects of language, syntax, semantics, and mathematical embedding contribute to different difficulty of the word problems. It's like it's unknown. Right? And so here we have a way of generating ever slight variation across any dimension and basically uncovering that. Here's another example. Same problem, different questions. In this case, we're varying the actual kind of thing that's unknown. But we don't have time to read all this. But let's say I want to now have kids learn to actually model something in equation. I want all word examples in the medieval context that actually exercise this type of equation. Here are the set of automatically generated things. Right? So it doesn't sound robotic at all. There's a whole bunch of weird stuff in there. This one is pretty good, for example. And now, for example, now I want Harry Potter and I want a slightly different equation. Again, automatically generated. In this case, now we have flubber mucus for the dizziness potion. We have snake fangs for long forgotten charms. We have Quidditch, or whatever that thing is called. So this is the game. So the entire lore around Harry Potter now is at the disposal of composing all sorts of variable content around word problem. And if you think about it, this is kind of being able to look at the word problem and to model mathematically what it actually means. In some sense, is a holy grail that you would need for physics or pretty much anything else. Because that's what it's about. You have a real world problem. How do you actually use this powerful thing, which is mathematical representation or modeling, to solve it? And now we have actually a way to do this. So interestingly, if I take math out and I take logic relations in there. So now I say, Nancy exerted revenge on John because he did something really mean to two of her friends. Okay? That's a logical statement. I can generate a paragraph from that and ask, what was Nancy's motivation? Right? So now I can basically, because I know that the paragraph came from that logic, I know that that's the answer to that question. So we're now looking into actually using reading comprehension and constructing just the right 2-sentence or 3-sentence constructs that will actually scaffold and build the understanding of sort of logical inferences that you really need to do to actually be able to understand large paragraphs. So all of these things are possible now because we have these parameterized ways to generate content. That means we can start with any content and amplify it by 10 or 100%, 100 times even if you wanted to. Now that we have that kind of content, we can now start looking at the data-driven optimal pathway. So now we're looking at, I can change all sorts of these different things. And a curriculum exists in many ways in which I can vary all these things. And I can generate them even on the fly. Or I can pre-compute them into these huge amounts of buckets. And now I'm assured that I'm not missing some dimension that may be highly important towards kids' learning. OK, so what does this mean? What it means is that I want, in real time, for every new student to be able to maximally inform the outcomes of the future students. Okay? So that's the fundamental outcome. I've given these kinds of statements before, but so I'll do it again. But in my view, I think that the key thing is not to assess kids. Kids are wonderfully general, plastic, adaptable. They can do amazing things. What we should be assessing in any ways is just our way of helping them. Okay? So really what it should, the assessment is misdirected on kids. It should really be directed onto stuff that we're creating. And so what I mean by that is that, and if you look at sort of, for kids or for teachers, they don't care about this dashboard. They're like, okay, well, you're telling me that these kids, like 30% of my kids are really bad at this. Thank you very much. Yeah, I know that, right? The problem is, tell me what I should do next. And unless you have that answer, all data you may have is completely useless. And that's something that was clear to me from the outset. And you see that even large companies funded by large foundations are completely falling flat if they just talk about collecting data, right? You can't just collect data. You have to have this next best action. And that changes the conversation completely. I mean, we're deploying this now to many different classrooms, and there's never been a single teacher that says, oh, you're going to collect my data? I don't really want that. Because I say, we don't have to collect your data, but we won't know what is the best next thing for the last 10 minutes of your classroom. Are you OK with that? No, I want that, right? So basically, they want to collect the data. So it completely changes the equation. The other aspect of this is that you can learn a lot from psychometrics and measuring and assessment, But if you want the next best action, psychrometrics is sort of a square peg trying to go into a round hole, right? In the sense that even if you assess the kids, what does that mean for your next best action? Maybe you have some kind of set of things that you predetermine that you should do next, but why the assessment is going to tell me which branch I should take? It's not obvious. You would have to sort of transform this wonderful structure for a different purpose, right? Instead, you should be asking the question, well, how do I optimize things for the next best action? If you just ask that is the ultimate question, right? And so what that means is, how do we do this automatically, very quickly, on a content that actually has many different things I can do, as opposed to the only action is when should I switch to the next chapter, which is kind of the standard way things are done now, right? So you're doing some stuff. No, you're not good enough. Keep doing more of the same. Okay. So the first step to this is bootstrapping the intractable, meaning that if you look at all these dimensions, it's overwhelming, right? No machine learning can actually achieve anything in that space. But if you can actually find the key dimensions that promote learning and then optimize those and then increase the dimensions according to their importance, now you can start to bootstrap the system and change the most important variables first with the first amount of data. And then as new kids come in, you start getting better and better towards those dimensions. When you reach the fixed point, you see that you can no longer improve based on those. You start folding in new dimensions that can specialize for more variability of kids, right? So now we have a structure that is cognizant of the fact that dimensionality is high. And I don't have to tell, we published a number of papers in this space, so I can tell you more about it, but I have to skip. The next thing is you have a history of students, and the question is, what's the next action that will optimize the long-term learning and engagement, right? So that's the fundamental question. And as phrased such, it's reinforcement learning. It's a particular part of machine learning. So let me give you a brief example of what this means. Here's a kid going through some particular progression initially. It seems to be doing pretty well towards the end. We tested on transfer, not so great. So this means, what we thought was good actually wasn't. Now this propagates back, and now we have a next kid that does maybe okay towards the end, but the transfer is successful. This propagates back. And now what is the next best progression for these set of kids? Is this one. Okay? It's the one that hasn't been traveled by a single kid yet, which basically points to the fact that we don't have to travel every single one of those exponentially large number of paths. We can actually have just the right way of using the information from many kids in order to figure out just the right trajectory. And of course, this is a single trajectory. What we want is a differentiated trajectory across many, many different kids. And that's what reinforcement learning is able to do. The other thing I want to point out is that when you talk about sort of variability between what you should present, oftentimes you could be talking about which concept should I introduce first, or how much should I dwell on a particular task. So in this case, dwell on A before I introduce B, or go right very quickly onto B. But one of the things that's not actually considered in terms of dimensions is if a kid knows how to solve something that requires concepts A, B, and C, and you introduce a concept D, what is the right thing to do? Do I just lump it together and say, here, solve something that requires all four concepts together? Or do I slowly bind it with each individual concept? And how does that vary for every type of curriculum, any type of level? How does that vary for every different kid? Right? Again, a huge number of swaths of dimensions that nobody really knows anything about. Okay, so here's some trials. In this case, these are all sorts of different machine learning algorithms that are figuring out the optimal progression of fractional reasoning. The 0 here is random ordering of those concepts. Okay? This is the expert progression. It's worse than random ordering. Okay? It's not because the learning scientists that did this were bad or uninformed. They're extremely smart people who have done this way longer and know way more about this than I do. The problem is that they didn't consider some dimensions that end up being fundamental for this space. Okay? In their mind, they had sort of simplified the problem to what they thought was salient, but they forgot some things that this sort of general looking at things doesn't. All right? And so therein lies the problem, right? This could be all of our course books, all of our games right now, okay, for all we know. Maybe not, but what do we know? All right, so the next thing I want to mention is the fact that what it means to optimize for mastery and engagement. And what I mean by that is obviously, I don't mean badges or anything like that, which actually have a spike, but they're nowhere close to that 6 months or over thing that I'm really looking for. So how many of you know about growth mindset in general, Carol Dweck's work? All right, half of you, so I'm going to go very quickly. So if you tell kids you're so smart, turns out they'll start to think that they're smart or not smart, and they're going to be fixed on that Gaussian curve at that place no matter what they do in the future. Okay? If you tell them you worked hard, there's a different kind of emergent behavior, namely growth mindset. Okay, so and this is sort of a wonderful theory, and it shows sort of long-term deleterious effects if you have a fixed mindset. It really, if you think of it, it's a meta skill that has deep implications, not on any content, but on life in general, right? But the problem here, as well as other places, is still is it the same way in which I have problems with psychometrics, namely, okay, we can maybe measure this thing, we can show the importance of it, but if kids is actually stuck on something, and you tell them you should work hard, what the hell does that mean? You know, they're like, yeah, what am I supposed to do with this, right? And so I actually told that to Carol, and to her infinite wisdom, she's like, you're right, let's do something about it. So we did. And so the question was, how do we actually develop growth mindset? And the good news is it can be taught. So what we did is basically have this game. It's been played by, I don't actually know how many people by now, but what we did is actually have 2 conditions. And the main thing about one condition is that we don't reward number of levels solved at all. It doesn't matter how many problems you solve at all. Forget about that. The only time you get any points is when you start thinking outside of the box, you get a new idea, or when you try sort of a new hypothesis. And more importantly, so remember we have this thought process language, so we can track what the kids are doing and how what they're doing is slightly different from what they've tried before. So they can't just game the system and just randomly shuffle things and get things because they're trying something new, unless there's a very deliberate process behind that, right? So what are the outcomes? Turns out that kids in this condition play way more levels than if you reward them on number of levels played. Okay? Here's some other things. So if you look at just first 3 minutes, you have deviations of these 2 control groups. This is only 30 minutes intervention. At the end of those 30 minutes, we'll give them something really hard, something that we knew nobody could solve. Okay? And these are percentages. So we're looking at how many struggling kids persist on this crazy hard problem after just 30 minutes. And you can basically see we have a huge percentage-wise increase of kids that we know cannot solve even some of the basic levels, but they're still working really hard and trying different hypotheses in this space. 30 minutes. Imagine what we can do if we have a curriculum centered around this kind of fine iterative feedback on specific things you should be doing and how you could be thinking about outside of the box for any new struggle that you encounter, right? But this raises another question. Like all these games that we're doing, they're promoting fixed mindset. Because all we reward is how many things you've solved, right? So we're doing stuff that's no different than what schools are doing in many ways, right? So really big question that actually changed a lot of designs that we're doing from now on. Okay, how many of you have seen Dragon Box, the game? All right, so for those of you who haven't, so the idea is it was developed by a Norwegian teacher who has a pretty creative way of scaffolding things. So initially you start with two sides, kind of sides of the equation. You want to isolate this box. It's kind of solve for x. So here I'm dividing by the tomato, and I can cancel these two tomatoes, and now the box is alone. I've solved that, right? So this starts like that. In this case, you look at now mosquitoes or whatever. But then later on, through the progression, goes to this. Right? So there's a full pathway all the way to solving very complex linear equations. Okay? Turns out the basic game reaches about kids can actually solve linear equations at 30%. 30% of the kids at the end of this game can solve it. What we're able to do is take 30% to 93% with a specialized adaptive things for every kid. Okay? That's over 60% improvement over the standard content material. How do we know this? We've tested it on 2 states and 1 country. All right. So I've told you about Washington. In this January, we've done it in Norway. Almost 8 million equations solved by kids. And then we use the data from these to improve the outcomes in Minnesota just 2 weeks later. And I'll tell you about this. So Minnesota actually has a smaller population than Washington, but you'll see some of the better outcomes. So you've already seen this. Here are some key things to note. If you look at all the kids who've reached mastery, this is the breakdown of how many problems they needed, right? So you can see that in some cases they needed almost 5 to 6 times more content than others. So unless your curriculum has 5 to 6 times more very specific targeted thing for every individual, you're not going to get to the 90s. It's just never going to happen. Okay? The same thing, it's even worse in time. If you look in time, you actually have order of magnitude, 10 times more time some kids need than others to reach mastery of those that they're in the 93%. So that means, holy crap, how do I get kids to spend 10 times more things? So it's now engagement and mastery together are very important, right? How do you get them to spend 10 times more time on something than the standard game actually produces? So what are the outcomes in Norway? Almost 10% of school-ready kids now have this concept mastered. After that 1 week, hour and a half on average, what they've spent. Here's another very interesting thing that didn't happen in Washington. 42% of all work is done in after school. So here's Washington. These are hours of the day. You can basically see after 2 o'clock, very, very little stuff is happening. If I look at Norway, very different pattern. Okay? So Norway is rich. Every kid has, I don't know, 10 computers for all I know. So that obviously is an enabler. But the key thing here is that teachers introduced the challenge. Kids didn't have to do this at home, right? At all. They could have played their Angry Birds or whatever else, but they didn't. Almost half of the learning actually happened at home. Voluntary homework. Who heard of that? Minnesota, as I said, we were able to do these adaptive things changing with more data, increase the mastery by 1.5%, and reduce the time to mastery by 5% compared to Washington State. So you can basically see very similar patterns across very different populations. You can see how levels to mastery, these are averages, they don't draw. This is not a very steep curve. Right? So this is a concept in the 7th grade, but you can basically see it can be mastered pretty much with slightly more content for different kids. Now we're doing Brazil, 42 million potential kids. But more importantly, we're actually doing, as I showed you, we have a way of scaffolding word problems now. And so we're going to basically go into not just solving the equations for the sake of solving the equation, because that's not really the deep understanding that we want kids to get, but we basically want them to learn how to isolate variables, form relationship between those variables, form them into equations, and then solve systems of equations that emerge from word problems. That entire process we will scaffold through the game. And we're hoping to do this on a national level as well in the fall, depending on the outcomes on the Washington State. All right. So as I told you, I talked to you a lot about adaptation to the student, but really there are many other things that need to be adapted. And this lesson, why don't you pull out your, if you have computers and that's not iPad, it's not going to work. It needs to run Flash. Go to this website. I'm going to talk while you do this. There's going to be a link at the bottom still, so we can do this in parallel. But imagine this particular delivery platform. The teacher has a tablet. The kids could have a laptop or whatever. And now I can actually structure the lesson plan into a set of activities that are if a teacher switches to a next activity, almost like an e-reader, the activity for all the kids changes. All right, so that's kind of serial, not so interesting. But imagine now, if you want to explore the space of all possible blended classrooms, you can actually do that here. So in this case, what if I separate the kids into 2 groups, and I have them actually doing things? Or even more interestingly, what if I have them do a paired work? So paired work basically means first they do it individually. The kids are assessed based on how well they know. And then we're pairing them based on kid that knows with kid that has developing understanding. And their goal, and every other tablet goes blank and says, go play with Nancy, go play with John, etc. Right? So this whole organizational structure automatically happens. And the kids are solving for this specific purpose of being able to do it individually afterwards way better than they did before. So everybody's trying to, so the kid that really understands this is trying to explain the concept to the other kids. So we have this sort of deeper learning sort of aspect of things embedded into the actual platform, right? So what are the set of things we can do now? We can actually figure out what's the optimal activity sequence that's most robust to any kind of teacher or student around any kind of game, right? Wouldn't that be great if we knew what is the best sequence of activities that would promote most learning, regardless of what kind of classroom we go to? Or, for example, at the end, 10 minutes before the class ends, the teacher gets this notice, based on your demographics and your current level of understanding of your kids, these are the 3 activities that would be best serving the bottom 30% of your classroom. Would you like to use those? Of course, teacher has a choice, but of course they always pick that because selecting no is a big guilt trip later on. So, so those are the kind of things that are possible. So we can optimize not just what the kid gets, but the entire classroom is now adaptive in the same way, right? Or what are the set of blended nodes or stations and how we should circle kids around? Everybody's experimenting in that space in an ad hoc way. Here, we have a principled way of actually doing this. And here are some of the outcomes I'll show you. So we've done some trials with the same teacher, same curriculum, and we basically have this platform and paper. And let me actually show you some of those. Here are some of the interesting outcomes. Basically, given a test score, you can see that teacher is actually ending up helping almost 3 times more kids on average than on a regular platform. So it's like way more assists are actually happening in this space. Look at basically the score of kids on this particular platform versus the paper version, right? They have immediate feedback, and they're encouraged to work hard on correcting their own problems. With assistive technology, they're able to solve way more problems. Here's even more shocking. Obviously, paper is limited in terms of amount of content. Here's the spread of all the things that kids are doing in this space. On average, kids do 3 times more content than on the paper version. It's like if we added 3 more classrooms times for every one of those. That's how much more effective kids can be with this kind of targeted intervention, right? And so all of this data is here. So I can, if I want to look at, Were you able to connect? For those of you who have pulled out a laptop? Yeah? All right, let's try to do this quickly. I think it's this one. Oh, really? Because this one is the one I connected before. Well, the perils of live demos. Okay, conf, is that the one? And is there a password now?
The access code is CRESST.
Okay. Oh, well. No, it said they couldn't do it. Restart my browser? Oh, but then this link is going to be gone. Okay. Nope. Yeah, it says can't connect to the network. Oh, well. Maybe it's because all of you logged in at the same time, and now I can't do it. Yeah, I think that we don't have time now to do it. So, because we only have 2 minutes, and unfortunately, is there another one?
We can go to this URL later, right?
Well, you can try it, but I'm actually delivering the content which automatically changes what you're seeing. And it can assign you automatically into groups and all these other things I was going to show you, right? But unless I'm actually driving it, you're just going to see a standby screen. Oh, well, you'll have to talk to me afterwards, and I can show you. Thank you very much.